Hello there and welcome to the Week in Parliament. Coming up, after the resignation of Dame Justice Lowell Goddard, there are questions for the Prime Minister about the running of the child sex abuse inquiry.
Can she now finally tell us when she personally learnt of the serious problems developing in this inquiry and why it was that she took no action at all?
The Home Secretary cannot intervene on the basis of suspicion, rumour or hearsay.
As a new committee is set up to keep an eye on Brexit, one veteran chairwoman tells us what its biggest challenge will be.
Getting the information which will enable them to ask the tough questions on behalf of Parliament and the public to ensure that the government is getting the best deal.
And a withering verdict on Sir Philip Green as MPs demand the former owner of BHS is stripped of his knighthood.
He took the rings from BHS's fingers, he beat it black and blue, he starved it of food and water, he put it on life support, and then he wanted credit for keeping it alive.
But first, to the child sexual abuse inquiry, where the question that wouldn't go away in the week was who knew what and when about the resignation of Dame Justice Lowell Goddard. The third appointee to head the inquiry stepped down in August, saying she was lonely. But newspapers suggested there'd been concerns about her competence and professionalism, though she strenuously denied reports of misconduct. The Home Secretary said her department had only been told about concerns over Dame Lowell a few days before she quit, and she explained why she'd made no mention of any complaints when she was questioned about the resignation by MPs on the Home Affairs Committee.
I was asked why Dame Lowell had gone. Dame Lowell had not spoken to me about her reasons, so I relied on the letter she had sent to the committee. In her letter, she said she was lonely and felt that she could not deliver, and that was why she stepped down. Dame Lowell has strongly refuted the allegations about her, and the only way we could understand properly why she resigned would be to hear from Dame Lowell herself. To echo any further allegations, which are now likely to be the subject of legal dispute, would have been entirely inappropriate.
She says that she was reliant on Justice Goddard's letter. But why didn't she ask? Why didn't she get a formal response from her as to why she was going?
The next day, MPs heard directly from members of the panel.
What was your relationship like and your working conditions and working relationship like with Dame Lowell in her 60 months there that coincided with your tenures?
I'll
start, Professor
start
J. Yes.
That the others can make their own contributions. It was clear from the beginning that Lowell Goddard really would have preferred to sit on her own without the assistance of a panel.
There were challenges. However,
that's a very all-encompassing word, challenges, usually.
Well, and indeed there were some fairly all-encompassing challenges too. But what I will say is the Chair was not always present in the United Kingdom through that entire 16-month period. And so we were able to continue with our work for extensive periods without very much contact with the Chair. There were times when things were perfectly amicable and perfectly professional. There were other times when it was less the case.
So was she a nightmare to work with, as some papers have suggested?
I would not use that language.
What language would you use?
I would prefer to say that there were challenges.
A day after that, a Labour MP asked Theresa May what she knew.
She set up the inquiry, she appointed the chair, she was the individual responsible for the inquiry's success. She was the Home Secretary in April, and she was the only person who had the power to act. So can she now finally tell us when she personally learnt of the serious problems developing in this inquiry and why it was that she took no action at all?
Prime Minister.
Can I say, I recognise that the Honourable Lady has taken a particular interest in this issue, and I'm sure she will recognise, as I hope other members of this House do, why it was that I set up the inquiry. For too long, people who had been subjected to child... For too long, people who'd been subjected to child sexual abuse had their voices went unheard, and they felt they weren't getting justice. That's why it's very important that the inquiry is able to continue and find that justice for them. There were stories around about the inquiry and about individuals related to the inquiry, but the Home Secretary cannot intervene on the basis of suspicion, rumour or hearsay.
Theresa May. Now, on Wednesday afternoon, John Bercow stood up and announced a set of election results. He was telling MPs who'd been chosen to chair a handful of select committees. Among the winners, Labour's Hilary Benn, who's to head a new committee shadowing the department for exiting the EU. It's a big job and it's going to be a big committee with a room-busting 21 members. So where do you start and what should a good committee aim to do? Well, I'm delighted to say that with me is Dame Margaret Hodge, who frequently made the headlines when she was the chair of the Public Accounts Committee. Dame Margaret, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you.
Let's start by talking about what you think a good committee should do. What should be the point of it?
Well, the point is to hold the executive to account. That's our job on behalf of the public. So how do you do it? You do it best by building consensus. These are cross-party committees. They reflect Parliament, but the strongest committees with the best impact are the ones where you can build consensus across the political spectrum in what you're looking at. And I think the questions you have to ask are the questions the public would want you to ask.
Well, that brings us very neatly to looking at this committee that Hilary Benn is going to chair. Now, it's a tough job looking at the department for exiting the EU, but it's going to have 21 members. That's really unusual for a select committee. Is that going to make its job impossible?
Well, first of all, I think Hilary is a brilliant choice of chair because he's very experienced. He's good at building consensus. And he's got a long history of knowledge. He's got good knowledge and expertise in the subject, so he's good. But I must say, I sort of recoiled in a bit of horror when I saw that he'd have 21 people on his committee. Because my experience from when I ran the committee was actually often our most effective sessions were ones that we didn't have all our members turn up to. So we were down to perhaps 5, 6, 7 members. And that meant you could really work as a team, again, across political parties, but you could focus collectively in a much more coherent way. So 21 is pretty hard work. And of course, on Brexit, views are so different and people are so divided on the subject. Building consensus is going to be a really tough ask.
Well, one of the reasons it's been set up the way that it has is to try to reflect a breadth of opinion and also to represent the United Kingdom geographically. But if you think 21 is too many, how would you have done it?
I would have had fewer in number, and I think you can reflect the diversity of views and the different geographical locations in a much better way. I think, I don't know, I cannot understand why they put up 21 members. So, but that's what Hilary has got. It was agreed by Parliament, so that's what he has to work with. And I hope that he finds a way of working which will not mean that you get these very stilted sessions where everybody feels they've got to have their 2 pennies worth, and actually you can never follow issues through logically.
Because its role is going to be scrutiny. It's not going to be in the remit of producing reports. It's going to be scrutinising.
Yeah.
So if you have a lot of members, it's going to be quite difficult to form an attack if you like to work together.
I hope that they can collectively agree a way of working which makes them an effective committee. That's the most important, is to be an effective committee. And I'm thinking of the sessions that we have in when we hold the Prime Minister to account, all the chairs of the Select Committee together. Now, if we all were in the same room together, holding the Prime Minister to account, I can't remember, there'd be 25, 30 of us in the room. So what we decided to do was actually to limit the numbers for the session. Everybody gets a go, because if you're in one session, you don't necessarily come to the next one. But that might be a technique that the committee collectively decide would make them more effective.
Now, how is this committee going to be able to get the government to take any notice of anything it says? Because that's obviously the other tough part of all of this, is getting the government to pay attention.
I think the more difficult question for this committee will be getting the information which will enable them to ask the tough questions on behalf of Parliament and the public to ensure that the government is getting the best deal as we exit Europe. And I suppose my only bit of advice to Hillary, he won't need much because he's much more experienced than I am, but my bit of advice would be don't just rely on the traditional mechanisms for doing that. So the whether it's government departments, they may be reluctant to give him information, or whether it's indeed the advisors. What I found really helpful when we were doing the work of holding the government to account for expenditure was material we got from journalists, television programme makers and whistleblowers. So I think looking beyond Parliament, beyond the civil service, beyond government, at how you can get the information, because that'll be his challenge, to then interrogate the government and hold them to account, will be one of the ways in which he can get a more effective committee.
All right, well, we'll be looking closely to see how he does. Dame Margaret Hodge, thank you very much for coming into the programme.
Thank you.
Now, let's take a look at some of the other news from around Westminster in brief. The Defence Secretary has told MPs the so-called Islamic State group is failing in Iraq, but warned the fight to regain the country's second largest city, Mosul, will not be a quick operation. The city in northern Iraq was overrun by IS militants in 2014.
The Daesh extremists now hold only 10% of Iraqi territory. Ridding Iraq of Daesh was never going to be quick or easy. As we enter the third year of the campaign, real progress is being made, and defeating Daesh in the long term will help make the streets of Britain and Europe safer.
On Wednesday, Prime Minister's questions began with both Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn remembering the tragedy at Aberfan. On October the 21st, 1966, an avalanche of coal waste crashed into a school and 18 houses in the South Wales village, killing 116 children and 28 adults. The disaster made headlines around the world, and Jeremy Corbyn reckoned it would never be forgotten.
Many in that community are still living with that tragedy, and they will live with that tragedy for the rest of their days. I remember it very well as a young person growing up at that time and watching collections for the disaster fund. I think the BBC documentary presented by Hugh Edwards last night was absolutely brilliant and poignant, and serves to remind us all of what that disaster was about.
I'm of an age where I can remember those terrible scenes on television of what happened in Aberfan. I didn't see the whole of Hugh Edwards' documentary, but the bits that I did happen to see last night I thought were very poignant, as the Right Honourable Gentleman said. And interestingly, actually, what it showed again was that issue of those in power not being willing to step up to the plate initially and accept what had actually happened.
Jeremy Corbyn moved on to his main topic, mental health and the NHS in England.
1 in 4 of us will suffer a mental health problem. Analysis by the King's Fund suggests that 40% of our mental health trusts had their budgets cut last year. 6 trusts have seen their budgets cut for 3 years in a row. Is the Prime Minister really confident that we are delivering parity of esteem for mental health?
It is right that we are introducing parity of esteem for mental health in our National Health Service. This has, we've been waiting too long for this. It's important that it is being done. But we are actually investing more in mental health services, an estimated record 11.7 billion, and particularly we're increasing the overall number of children's beds to the highest number of children's beds in relation to mental health problems.
Downing Street said that Theresa May had full confidence in her Chancellor Philip Hammond after reports he was trying to slow progress towards the UK leaving the EU. Some newspapers said colleagues believed that Mr Hammond was attempting to undermine the process by delaying decisions on migrant curbs. Well, the man himself was asked about the newspaper stories and the government's line that it wouldn't give a running commentary on the negotiations.
The government can't keep this stuff secret for 24 hours between itself. Once it gets into the hands of our counterparties, 27 countries plus the EU, It might as well be published in the newspapers.
Well, I think that it would be far more helpful to this debate if we were able to conduct these internal discussions privately without leaks to newspapers. We need space to explore different options, to discuss among ourselves. It's no secret that there are different views about how we should approach the negotiation, and we are exploring together how to give the Prime Minister the very best negotiating
I think
hand.
your first sentence gives a clear, in response, gives a pretty clear view of your own attitude to it all.
Staying with Brexit, the Romanian ambassador to the UK has told peers why freedom of movement is so important to people from his country. He said Romanians treasured the idea because of the years Romania spent behind the Iron Curtain.
When I was a child, I couldn't travel in the West because it was not permitted. The only permission I and my parents had was to travel in the socialist. I could travel to Poland, for instance, to my friends, or to the Czech Republic, or to Hungary. So we feel much more this freedom of movement. Figures, numbers are important, but the sense of moving free around the world, working, changing your workplace, everywhere.
Now to Friday in the Commons, where ministers were accused of trying to hijack plans to introduce a so-called Turing's Law to pardon gay men convicted of now abolished sexual offences. On Thursday, the government announced plans for thousands of gay and bisexual men convicted of crimes which are no longer on the statute book to be posthumously pardoned. But the next day, the SNP's John Nicholson pressed ahead with his own private member's bill, proposing an automatic pardon for the living too.
How odd would it look for the elderly to be told that they must wait until they die for the automatic pardon which the government now seems to be proposing? Let us finish, Mr Deputy Speaker, the law reform that we have started by recognising that the victims of society's prejudices are still hurting and they're still alive. They deserve the peace that this bill would bring.
Meanwhile, down the corridor in the House of Lords, peers too were bringing in their own bills. First up, the Conservative Lord Elton, with his proposals for cutting the size of the House of Lords. He proposed reducing the overall number, but with each group keeping the same proportion of peers. The bill will now go forward to be considered in detail. Staying with Friday's business, back in the Commons, a Conservative Philip Davis asked an urgent question. He wanted to know what checks were being carried out to make sure child refugees coming from Calais were children.
People only have to see the pictures of the so-called child refugees to see that many of them are not children. A large number of my constituents, Mr Deputy Speaker, have contacted me to say how angry they are that we're being taken for fools, taken for a ride, and our generosity is being abused. Does the Minister not understand that unless a grip is taken over this, then it will do irreparable damage to public confidence in the asylum system?
But the Minister dismissed the idea of carrying out dental checks.
The British Dental Association has described them as inaccurate, inappropriate and unethical. The Royal College of Paediatricians said the margin of error can sometimes be as much as 5 years either side of medical tests. And doctors of the World UK have called the idea unethical and unnecessary.
On Thursday, MPs backed a call for the former owner of BHS, Sir Philip Green, to be stripped of the knighthood he was awarded for services to retail. The firm collapsed with 11,000 jobs lost and a more than £570 million pension deficit. A damning MP's report on the high street chain's failure, published in July, concluded Sir Philip had extracted large sums and left the business on life support.
When Sir Philip acquired BHS, it was a relatively prosperous business and it had a pension scheme in surplus.
He risked his workers' pensions while he made huge profits.
You can amass a great fortune, but in such turbulent market times you can lose it in a day. And all you are left with is your honour.
He took the rings from BHS's fingers, he beat it black and blue, he starved it in food and water, he put it on life support, and then he wanted credit for keeping it alive.
Now let's take a look at some of the other news from around Westminster. Here's Duncan Smith with our countdown.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You know you're getting old when peers of the realm start looking young. Or are they actually getting younger? The youngest, Baroness Burton, took her seat on Tuesday, aged just 38, taking the total number of peers to 814 on our Erminometer. 4. Brexit, Brexit, Brexit. It's all we ever hear these days. And now it turns out the issue hasn't escaped the interest of the creators of a hit computer game, Football Manager. Players of the 2017 edition will have to grapple with different Brexit scenarios as part of the game. Sounds fun? 3. There could be another referendum on the horizon as the Scottish Government published its draft bill on a second independence referendum on Thursday. 2. The potential new runway at Heathrow Airport is a conundrum that could hardly be called a piece of cake. But that's exactly what Amsterdam Airport Schiphol send in every time a decision on Heathrow is delayed. And they did it again on Wednesday. And that wasn't the only cake on offer this week. No doubt Conservative backbencher Peter Bone found time for a slice with some candles on for his special day, which even the Prime Minister couldn't ignore at PMQs on Wednesday.
I'm very happy to wish him a very happy birthday today, many happy returns. I hope that Mrs. Bone is going to treat the occasion in an appropriate manner and...
The number of MPs in Westminster is set to drop from 650 to 600 ahead of the 2020 general election if the results of Boundary Commission recommendations are accepted. The Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn and ex-Chancellor George Osborne are among those whose seats would be abolished. Labour, which is expected to be hardest hit, called the proposals undemocratic, but the government says they ensure an equal say for each voter. Plans to slash the number of seats in England, Wales and Northern Ireland have already been outlined, and recommendations for Scotland were published on Thursday, cutting Scottish seats at Westminster from 59 to 53. Political analyst David Cowling gave evidence on Tuesday to the Boundary Commission, and I asked him how significant the changes were for Scotland.
Scotland loses 6 out of the 50, which is reasonably significant, of course, but the big change for them, of course, had been in the 2005 general election when they went down from about 72 MPs to 59 because of the introduction of the Scottish Parliament. So this is significant, but not quite as traumatic as the ones they'd had before.
Now, if we'd have had these seats in the 2015 general election, how different would this Parliament look?
Well, a lot of this has to be based upon guesswork, but it is generally thought that Labour would be down about 30 seats, for example, as a consequence of these changes politically, on the basis of the tentative boundaries that we have before us. So it would have been a case of consolidating the Conservative victory, and the Conservative victory would have been more significant on these boundaries compared with what it was in 2015.
Now, Labour is unhappy about the proposed changes. Is the Labour Party just being grumpy? Will the new system be fairer?
I suppose most parties, most times, have grievances, but I think the issue that it's not just limited to Labour, but is a perennially difficult one, is that, of course, the commissioners have to freeze a moment in time when they take the electorate. And then they say, this is the electorate, and this is on what we'll base our calculations for sizes of constituencies, the quota. But of course, there have been millions of people who have added themselves onto the register in the round of 2015, and of course more people came on for the European referendum. And the complaint of Labour and some of the other parties is that these people will be missed off those registers. And therefore, if they had been on the register, maybe the landscape would be very different.
Now, the Boundary Commission in the past has always tried to stick to traditional boundaries. Is that going to be less the case this time around? Are they going to have to cross more borders?
In the past, they were allowed to vary the electorate by plus or minus 10%, which gave them a chance to take in rivers and mountains and communities. But now maths rules everything in this round, and they've been given plus or minus 5%. And so there you've got some real squeals of pain. And for example, in Cornwall, of course, you have a proposal to cross a Cornish constituency with a Devon one. I mean, the biggest noise since the Monmouth Rebellion, I think, has arisen from that. So the maths is what's motoring most of this, and that's what's causing a lot of the difficulty, because it doesn't allow the commissioners to do much.
All right, well, just finally on the maths then. I mean, the whole point of this was David Cameron's promise to reduce the cost of politics. We're going to lose 50 MPs, but it's always going to be a slightly hard one to get through whilst you've got a House of Lords which is at 800 members and growing.
I agree. We've got this controlled system, so to speak, in one chamber and no control whatsoever in the other. And that's obviously given rise to problems. But also, I think there was a lot of support for the reduction in the number of MPs from 650 to 600, generally because MPs are disliked. But anybody who knows MPs these days, with the complexity of what's happening in their constituencies and the rest of it, they're certainly not, you know, the laziest of individuals in terms of the demands on them. And so it's going to be interesting to see, as we go forward, the people who rejoiced in the reduction in the number of MPs, whether they're the same people who start knocking on the door saying, well, why isn't my MP giving me time? Why aren't I going? Because they've got so much more else to do these days, and now there are fewer of them to do it.
All right, David Cowling, as ever, thank you very much indeed for coming into the programme. Political analyst David Cowling. And that's it from us for now. But do join Joanna Shin on Monday night at 11 for a full roundup of the best of the day here at Westminster. But for now, from me, Alicia McCarthy, goodbye.